The Age of Faith and Fire, the Crusades and the Birth of Modern Europe, Part 1 of the Renaissance Saga. 1. The Shadow of the Crescent. When the crescent moon rose above Jerusalem and the banners of Islam spread across 3 continents, Europe looked eastward in awe and fear. From the mountains of Spain to the gates of Constantinople, tales of a mighty civilization whispered through the monasteries and markets of Christendom. In the West, kings and peasants alike spoke of the Holy Land, the place where Christ had lived and died, now under Muslim rule. To many, it was a wound in the heart of faith. To others, it was an opportunity of divine calling to reclaim what had been lost. And so, in the year 1095, a voice echoed across Europe. Pope Urban II stood before the crowd in Clermont, his words blazing with conviction. Deus vult, God wills it. Those 2 words would ignite centuries of holy war, ambition, and transformation. 2. The call to arms. Knights left their castles. Farmers abandoned their plows. Merchants sold all they owned to fund their journey. Across France, England, and the German states, tens of thousands marched toward Jerusalem, wearing crosses stitched onto their tunics. They called themselves Crusaders, warriors of the cross. But their motives were mixed: faith, greed, redemption, glory. Some sought forgiveness, others adventure, and a few sought only gold. When the first Crusaders reached the Holy Land in 1099, what began as a pilgrimage became a storm. They besieged Jerusalem for weeks. When the city finally fell, rivers of blood ran through its streets. Christians wept with joy, Muslims and Jews with despair. The Crusaders built kingdoms on the ashes-fragile foreign outposts in a sea of Islamic lands. 3. East meets West. Though born of blood, the Crusades also brought something unexpected: exchange. From the Muslims, Europeans discovered science, mathematics, architecture, and medicine, long lost since Rome's fall. They learned of Aristotle's philosophy through Arabic translations, of algebra and astronomy, of paper and compass. Silks, spices, and stories flowed along the same roads as soldiers once had. The East and West had clashed, but they had also connected, and in that connection lay the seed of Europe's rebirth. 4. The fall of Constantinople. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the shield between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. But in 1453, that shield shattered. The Ottoman Turks, heirs of a powerful new Islamic empire, surrounded Constantinople, the last jewel of Rome's legacy. For 53 days, cannon fire shook its ancient walls. When the city finally fell to Sultan Mehmed II, the crescent moon rose above the Hagia Sophia. Europe trembled. Yet from this loss came another transformation. Scholars, fleeing the fallen city, carried with them ancient Greek texts and knowledge long forgotten in the West. They brought not swords, but wisdom. That wisdom would spark a fire brighter than any crusader's torch. 5. The dawn of the Renaissance. In Italy's city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, new light began to shine. It was not the light of conquest, but of curiosity. Men like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael sought not war, but understanding. They painted the divine in the faces of men, sculpted beauty from stone, and studied the secrets of the heavens. The church still ruled, but thought was breaking free. Art, science, and faith began to intertwine in ways unseen since ancient Greece. The word Renaissance, rebirth, spread like the dawn. 6. Faith and fire. Yet this new age was not free of conflict. While artists and thinkers reached for the divine through reason and creation, others clung to the certainties of faith. The church, vast and powerful, began to fear its own shadow. Questions arose. Why must faith and reason be enemies? Could a man understand God through nature as well as scripture? In Florence, in Rome, in Paris, these questions would burn brighter and more dangerous than any crusader's flame. The Renaissance and Reformation, when faith and reason collided, Part 2 of the Age of Faith and Fire. 7. Florence, the city of light, at the heart of Italy, by the banks of the Arno River, rose the city of Florence, a place where stone and spirit danced together. Beneath its red roofs, merchants and artists, thinkers and priests walked the same narrow streets. In the 15th century, the Medici family, wealthy bankers and patrons of the arts, turned Florence into the cradle of the Renaissance. Their money built cathedrals. Their vision nurtured geniuses. It was here that Leonardo da Vinci, a quiet apprentice with curious eyes, first sketched machines that could fly and studied the secrets of anatomy under candlelight. He painted The Last Supper, where divine faith met human emotion. His art spoke of a God not distant, but alive in every detail of creation. Florence became a mirror of the human soul, torn between heaven and earth, between devotion and discovery. 8. The printing revolution. While Florence dreamed in art, another revolution was brewing in ink and paper. In Germany, a craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. For the first time in history, books could be copied not by hand, but by machine. Knowledge that once belonged only to priests and nobles now flowed into the hands of the common people. The Bible itself could be read, not only heard. Ideas spread faster than armies. And once minds began to think freely, they could not easily be chained again. 9. The church in crisis. The medieval church had once been the unshakable heart of Europe. Popes crowned kings, sold indulgences, and ruled over the souls of millions. But beneath its marble halls, corruption festered. Bishops lived as princes, selling forgiveness for gold. The faithful prayed, but too often their faith was exploited by those who claimed to speak for God. Many still believed, but whispers began to rise. Is salvation something you can buy? Can a man stand before God without the permission of Rome? Europe was on the edge of a storm. 10. Martin Luther's stand. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther walked to the doors of the church in Wittenberg. In his hand, he carried a document with 95 theses, challenges to the authority of the Pope and the corruption of the church. He nailed them to the wooden door, not knowing he had struck the first spark of revolution. Luther declared that salvation came through faith alone, not wealth or indulgences. He translated the Bible into German so that every man could read it. His words spread across Europe like wildfire, thanks to Gutenberg's press. The church branded him a heretic. The Holy Roman Emperor summoned him to recant. Luther refused. Here I stand, I can do no other. With that, the unity of Christendom shattered. 11. The Reformation spreads. The ideas Luther unleashed could not be contained. Across Europe, preachers, scholars, and kings began to take sides. In Switzerland, John Calvin preached of predestination and moral discipline. In England, Henry VIII broke from Rome, founding the Church of England for both power and conscience. What had begun as reform became revolution. Wars of faith swept the continent. Brother fought brother. Churches burned. Yet from the ashes, new freedoms emerged. The freedom to question, to believe differently, to seek God in one's own way. The Renaissance had awakened the mind. The Reformation awakened the soul. 12. Faith and science. While priests argued over scripture, another kind of faith was being born. Faith in reason. In Poland, Copernicus looked to the heavens and dared to suggest that Earth was not the center of the universe. In Italy, Galileo Galilei built a telescope and saw moons circling Jupiter. The heavens, once thought fixed, were alive with motion. When the church condemned him, Galileo whispered, "And yet, it moves." It was not rebellion for the sake of pride, but the pursuit of truth. He, like many of his time, believed that studying creation was another way of honoring the Creator. Faith and science were not enemies, they were two hands reaching toward the same light. The age of discovery and enlightenment. When the world awoke to itself, Part 3 of the story of faith and civilization. 13. The ocean opens. The 16th century dawned with sails on the horizon. Europe, restless after centuries of prayer and war, turned its eyes toward the unknown. From Portugal and Spain came men who believed the world was larger than any map had shown. Christopher Columbus, with a small fleet and enormous faith, crossed a terrifying ocean in 1492, believing he could reach the Indies by sailing west. He did not find Asia. He found a new world. Behind him came Vasco da Gama, rounding Africa's Cape of Good Hope to reach India. Ferdinand Magellan, whose crew would circumnavigate the globe. The oceans, once thought to end in dragons and darkness, became highways of trade and conquest. But discovery carried a heavy shadow. Native peoples enslaved, lands claimed, faith used to justify empire. The cross and the sword often arrived together. Still, something vast had begun. The realization that humanity shared one planet. 14. Faith on new shores. Missionaries followed the explorers, carrying the name of Christ to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Some came in compassion, others came with conquest. In the jungles of South America, Jesuit priests built missions and schools, learning native languages and recording their histories. In Asia, Francis Xavier preached in India and Japan, planting seeds of Christianity far from Rome. Yet the same faith that inspired courage also justified colonization. Gold and souls were counted together. Kingdoms built cathedrals beside slave markets. The question grew louder. Can faith be true if it brings suffering? The world was expanding, and so was the conscience of humankind. 15. The birth of reason. By the 17th century, the universe seemed wider, deeper, and stranger than ever before. The telescope revealed distant stars, the microscope, unseen worlds. In England, Isaac Newton described gravity, the invisible thread that bound heaven and earth. In France, René Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am." Faith had once told man what to believe. Now, reason asked why. The Enlightenment was not a war against God, but against ignorance. Philosophers like Voltaire, John Locke, and Rousseau demanded freedom of thought, of speech, of conscience. They believed that truth was not owned by priests or kings, but by all who sought it. Yet the tension remained. Could a world ruled by logic still hold room for the divine? 16. The Age of Empires. As ideas blossomed, so did power. Europe carved the world into empires. British, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, faith and flag marched side by side. In the Americas, colonists fought for independence, inspired by Enlightenment ideals and biblical conviction alike. The words, "all men are created equal," echoed from pulpits and parliaments. But those same words clashed with the reality of slavery, oppression, and greed. The light of knowledge revealed the darkness within the human heart. 17. The philosophers' God. Not all turned away from faith. Some sought a new understanding, a God of order and reason, not of wrath and miracles. They called themselves deists, believing that God created the universe like a clockmaker, setting it in motion and letting it run by natural law. For others, faith became deeply personal. The Pietists and Methodists in Europe and America preached a return to love, compassion, and humility. Faith not of institutions, but of the heart. The old medieval world was fading. A new one, scientific, political, spiritual, was being born. 18. The revolution of minds. Ideas, once whispered in salons and studies, now ignited revolutions. In France, peasants stormed the Bastille, crying for liberty and equality. In America, colonies rose against kings. Across the world, people began to believe that the human mind, guided by reason and morality, could reshape destiny itself. Faith did not vanish, it evolved. Where once cathedrals stood as monuments to God's glory, now universities, libraries, and observatories rose, temples to knowledge, still echoing with the question, who are we and why are we here? 19. A new dawn. By the dawn of the 19th century, the world was connected by trade, ideas, and exploration. The earth was mapped, the heavens measured, yet the mystery remained. The more humanity discovered, the more it realized how much was unknown. Faith had changed, no longer the unchallenged authority of a single church, but a living dialogue between belief and reason, between the heart and the mind. Humanity stood at the threshold of modernity, gazing into an age of machines, industry, and revolutions yet to come. And somewhere, beneath the noise of progress, the eternal whisper of faith still spoke. In the beginning, the industrial age and the rise of secularism, when humanity replaced faith with progress. Part 4 of the story of faith and civilization. 20. The age of iron and smoke. By the 19th century, the quiet villages of Europe had awakened to the thunder of machines. Coal-fed engines roared, and black smoke curled into the skies over London, Manchester, and Berlin. The Industrial Revolution had begun. Steam-powered locomotives that crossed continents. Iron ships cut through oceans. Factories rose where fields once stretched. Humanity had learned to harness nature's forces, to build, to multiply, to dominate. But in the roar of progress, something sacred began to fade. The rhythm of prayer was drowned by the rhythm of gears. Men who once tilled the soil in devotion to God now labored 16 hours a day for wages. Churches still stood, but fewer entered them. The new creed was industry, the new God, profit. Yet amid the soot and steel, voices cried for compassion. What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? 21. Faith in the age of science. Science, once born in monasteries, had grown into its own kingdom. Charles Darwin, after years of studying life's diversity, published On the Origin of Species in 1859. His theory of evolution shook the foundations of faith. If species evolved through natural selection, where then was divine creation? For many, it was a revelation. For others, a betrayal. Yet Darwin himself never claimed to destroy God, only to understand his methods. Still, the damage was done. Churches divided, philosophers debated, and a new movement, secularism, rose to claim the human mind. Reason became the new altar. Progress became salvation. The future itself became faith. 22. The empires of men. While machines transformed cities, nations sought to dominate the world. Britain, France, and Germany built empires that spanned continents. They justified conquest with words like civilization and destiny. Missionaries and merchants walked the same paths. The Bible and the rifle often arrived together. In India, Africa, and Asia, ancient cultures were reshaped by Western ambition. Cathedrals stood beside factories. Railroads cut through sacred lands. Faith became a banner for empire, its purity stained by power. But from those lands also came wisdom, Eastern philosophies, mysticism, and a deeper sense of harmony with nature. Slowly, the world's faiths began to meet and mix, sowing the seeds of global spirituality. 23. The Age of Doubt. As the 19th century deepened, a shadow fell across the West. In Germany, Friedrich Nietzsche proclaimed, "God is dead." He did not mean the divine had ceased to exist, but that society no longer lived as if he did. Churches stood empty, their bells ringing hollow in the age of science and commerce. Artists and poets echoed this despair. The romantic soul longed for meaning in a world that seemed ruled by cold logic. The machine had given power, but also loneliness. Nietzsche's words became a mirror. Humanity, freed from God, now bore the burden of creating its own meaning. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Faith had not vanished. It had moved inward from cathedrals to the human heart. 24. The fire of revolution progress did not come without pain. Cities swelled with workers living in poverty, children toiling in factories. From this suffering rose new creeds: socialism, communism, nationalism, secular faiths promising salvation not of the soul but of society. Karl Marx, once a student of philosophy, declared religion the opium of the people. To him, faith numbed pain but never cured it. The true salvation, he said, would come when men controlled their own labor and destiny. Across Europe, revolutions flared, thrones fell, the church's power waned. The age of kings gave way to the age of the masses. 25. The search for the soul. As the century turned, humanity had gained machines, empires, and knowledge, but lost certainty. Psychologists like Sigmund Freud began exploring the human mind, uncovering hidden desires and fears. If the mind itself could be studied, what became of the soul? Artists painted dreams, not doctrines. Writers like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy wrestled with questions of faith in a godless age. Faith no longer ruled nations, it haunted hearts. The world had learned to fly, yet still searched for meaning among the clouds. 26. The twilight of faith. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world was modern, connected by telegraph, train, and telephone. Humanity could move faster, think faster, build higher. But beneath the triumph of progress, a quiet fear lingered. The same science that lit cities could also forge weapons. The same intellect that freed man from superstition could enslave him to ideology. Faith, though wounded, endured. In the poorest slums, in whispered prayers, in acts of compassion, it lived on. The question was no longer, is God real? But what kind of world do we build without him? Humanity stood at the edge of a new century, brilliant, powerful, and terribly uncertain. The Age of War and the Search for Meaning, Part 5 of the Story of Faith and Civilization. 27. The World on the Brink. The 20th century began with promise, electricity, automobiles, flight, and new discoveries. But beneath the surface of progress, old rivalries and new ambitions brewed. Nations armed themselves with machines of death, driven by pride, fear, and ideology. Empires clashed for land and power, their leaders invoking God and destiny to justify conquest. In 1914, a gunshot in Sarajevo ignited World War I, the war to end all wars. But it would not end anything. It would only begin a century of chaos. For 4 years, millions died in trenches filled with mud, gas, and despair. The prayers of soldiers rose into skies blackened by artillery fire. When the war finally ended, Europe was shattered. Its faith in progress, in humanity, and even in God deeply wounded. Where was God in the trenches? People asked. The silence was deafening. 28. After the fall, in the ruins of Europe, a new age of disillusionment began. The old world of kings, churches, and order was gone. The Roaring Twenties brought music, machines, and moral confusion. Cities glittered with jazz and neon lights, but beneath the laughter lay emptiness. People sought meaning in pleasure, in art, in politics, anywhere but in faith. Then came the Great Depression. Banks collapsed, millions starved, and the promise of endless progress vanished overnight. Desperation became fertile soil for new gods, born not in heaven, but in men's hearts. 29. The gods of ideology. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose, preaching a twisted gospel of race and power. In Russia, Joseph Stalin built a communist empire founded on fear. Both promised salvation through struggle and sacrifice, replacing prayer with propaganda, crosses with flags. They turned belief into weaponry. Churches burned, scriptures were banned. Faith was forced underground. World War II began not as a clash of nations, but of beliefs. It was the age of ideologies, Nazism, fascism, communism, each demanding absolute loyalty, each claiming to create a new heaven on earth. And in the process, they created hell. 30. The Holocaust and the silence of heaven in the dark heart of Europe. The Holocaust became the most haunting question of faith. 6 million Jews, the people of the covenant, were exterminated in camps of steel and ash. The world saw the face of evil not as a demon, but as men obeying orders. Many asked, how could God allow such horror? Others asked, how could men commit it? The theologian Elie Wiesel, a survivor, would later write, "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever." For many, the Holocaust marked the death of certainty, the end of blind belief in divine justice. Yet, for others, it was a call to cling to faith, not in triumph, but in tragedy. 31. The Atomic Age. In 1945, 2 blinding flashes lit the skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb ended the war and began a new era. Humanity had taken creation itself into its hands, wielding power once thought divine. For the first time, mankind could destroy the world it had built. Science had triumphed, but at a terrible cost. The same genius that split the atom now faced the abyss it had opened. Philosophers called it the death of innocence. Faith was no longer naive, It became a choice, an act of rebellion against despair. 32. The Cold War of Belief. The world split in two, the West and the East, capitalism and communism, freedom and control. But beneath the politics was a spiritual war. One side claimed belief in God and liberty, the other in equality and reason. Each built weapons in the name of peace. Each feared annihilation. Amid the fear, faith took new forms. Billy Graham's sermons filled stadiums in America. In Poland, a quiet priest named Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II, stood against oppression, armed only with prayer. Even in the heart of atheistic regimes, faith refused to die. It whispered in prisons, in poems, in the courage of those who believed that truth could outlast tyranny. 33. The existential cry. After 2 world wars, millions felt abandoned by both God and reason. Writers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre declared that life had no inherent meaning, that man was alone in an indifferent universe. Yet, even in their defiance, there was longing. Camus wrote, "In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer." Existentialism was not faith's enemy, it was its echo. The question was no longer, does God exist? But how should we live if he doesn't? Humanity had turned from heaven to itself and found both freedom and fear. 34. The search for peace. When the bombs fell silent, a new hunger began, not for conquest, but for meaning. In the ashes of war, the United Nations was born. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights echoed the moral truths once rooted in faith, that all people are equal in dignity. In the 1960s, young generations sought new forms of spirituality, not in cathedrals, but in consciousness. The hippie movement, Buddhism, meditation, and Eastern philosophy spread across the West. The words of Jesus, the Buddha, and the prophets met in the same breath. Faith, once divided by walls, began to see itself as one river with many names. 35. A fragile hope. As the 20th century closed, humanity stood between 2 lights, the glow of technology and the light of the soul. The Berlin Wall fell. Old empires crumbled. Faith resurfaced in new forms: social justice, environmental stewardship, human rights, and compassion. Pope John Paul II, the Dalai Lama, Mother Teresa, voices of mercy in a cynical age, reminded the world that even after so much darkness, faith could still heal. Humanity had walked through war, genocide, and despair, and yet, somewhere within, the ancient spark of belief still flickered. The story of faith was not over. It was only waiting for its next chapter. The Modern World. Faith in the Digital Age, Part 6 of the Story of Faith and Civilization. 36. The new millennium. At the dawn of the 21st century, the world seemed reborn. The Cold War was over, global trade thrived, and humanity stood united under the promise of progress. Satellites circled the Earth. The internet connected billions of minds. Science had conquered disease, mapped the human genome, and reached Mars. But in the glow of computer screens, the ancient questions remained. Only now they appeared in new forms. Who am I? What is truth? Why, with so much connection, do we still feel alone? Humanity had entered the digital age, and faith, once written on scrolls and carved in stone, now traveled at the speed of light. 37. The Towers Fall. On September 11, 2001, 2 planes tore through the skyline of New York City. The world watched in horror as faith was twisted into a weapon once more. The attacks shocked not only nations, but souls. How could belief, the force meant to heal, unleash such destruction? In the aftermath, people turned again to prayer. Churches filled, mosques trembled. The word God returned to headlines and hearts. But fear also grew. Wars followed. Borders hardened. The clash between religion and extremism reshaped the century, proving that faith, even in modernity, remained as powerful and dangerous as ever. 38. The age of information, the internet, became the new temple of humanity, a vast space where every voice could speak and every truth could be questioned. Social media gave birth to movements and revolutions, but also to confusion and rage. Where priests once interpreted scripture, now influencers and algorithms shaped belief. People began to choose their own truths. Some found new forms of spirituality, mindfulness, nature worship, personal philosophy. Others turned to conspiracy, materialism, or apathy. Faith had become fragmented, billions of tiny universes orbiting the same digital sun. In the beginning was the Word, the Gospel said. In the modern age, the Word became data. 39. Science and the soul. Meanwhile, science reached heights once thought divine. Telescopes peered to the edge of the universe. AI learned to think. Doctors edited DNA. Humanity had discovered the code of creation, and with it, the temptation to play God. Philosophers warned, we have the power of gods, but the wisdom of children. Yet many scientists, instead of abandoning faith, found awe in their discoveries. The more we understood, the greater the mystery became. Quantum physics, consciousness, the origin of life, all seemed to whisper of something beyond measure. Science and spirituality began to converge again, not as enemies, but as two languages describing the same wonder. 40. The loneliness of the modern soul. Never before had humanity been so connected and yet so isolated. The modern world offered endless distraction, but little peace. Anxiety, depression, and nihilism spread faster than any virus. People scrolled through oceans of information, but found little meaning. Churches struggled to reach the digital generation. Temples emptied. But faith did not die, it changed form. For many, faith became activism, saving the planet, defending justice, seeking purpose through compassion. Others turned inward to meditation, art, or silence. The soul, it seemed, still hungered for transcendence, something greater than the glowing screens and endless noise. 41. The rise of global spirituality as travel and technology united the planet. Ancient barriers fell. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and humanism began to intertwine in the global conversation. Interfaith dialogues flourished. Scientists and monks shared panels. The Dalai Lama spoke at universities. Popes posted on Twitter. Humanity was slowly realizing that faith was not a competition, but a conversation. The world's great religions, once rivals, now stood as mirrors of a single truth, that all humans seek meaning, compassion, and connection. 42. The machine and the spirit. In the 2020s, artificial intelligence emerged, a creation that could think, learn, and even create art and language. Some saw it as the next step of evolution, others as a threat to the soul. Could a machine understand faith? Could it pray? Could it love? Philosophers debated what consciousness truly was. Was it divine or just data? And yet, in the heart of every algorithm, there was a reflection of its maker, humanity reaching, once again, for something beyond itself. Perhaps the story of creation was not finished. Perhaps we, too, were part of it. 43. The return of wonder amid chaos and division. A quiet revival began. People rediscovered silence. Communities formed around kindness instead of creed. Artists, scientists, and seekers began speaking of a spirituality without borders, one that saw God not in temples, but in life itself. The universe, once seen as empty space, now shimmered with meaning. In the face of uncertainty, many returned to wonder, the oldest form of prayer. 44. The eternal question. And so, the story continues. From the fires of the ancient world to the screens of the digital age, humanity has never stopped asking, why are we here? What is good? What lies beyond death? Faith has changed faces 1,000 times, from prophets to popes, from manuscripts to code, but its heart has never died, because faith, in its truest form, is not the certainty of answers, but the courage to seek them. And as long as humanity can wonder, can hope, can love, the story of faith will never end. The future of faith, the next chapter of humanity, part 7 of the story of faith and civilization. 45. The age of departure. In the 22nd century, the Earth had grown small. The blue planet that once held every dream now shimmered in the rear view of spacecraft bound for Mars and beyond. Humanity had crossed another frontier, not just of technology, but of meaning. Artificial intelligence guided the colonies. Climate engineering healed the planet's scars. Life expectancy stretched past a century. Humans had learned to edit genes, merge mind with machine, and reach the stars. But even among the constellations, an old silence returned, the silence of the cosmos. As explorers gazed upon new worlds, a familiar question rose again. Are we alone? The same question whispered by prophets, scientists, and dreamers for millennia. 46. The God of the cosmos. Theologians of the future no longer spoke only of heaven above, but of universes within. Faith evolved into cosmotheism, the belief that divinity was not separate from creation, but woven into every atom, every star, every consciousness. The ancient texts, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, were no longer seen as dogma, but as early attempts to describe the infinite. Faith and science finally sat together, not as rivals, but as partners in awe. Quantum physics spoke of entanglement, the deep connection between all things. Mystics had spoken of the same truth for ages, that everything is one. Now, both equations and prayers pointed to the same horizon. 47. The digital soul. By the late 2100s, humanity had entered the age of digital consciousness. Neural interfaces allowed minds to live in virtual realms, to upload memories, to transcend the body itself. Death was no longer an ending, but a transformation. Some called it immortality, others heresy. Religions fractured again between those who saw the digital soul as a continuation of divine creation, and those who saw it as the final rebellion against God. The question of the future was not, does God exist, but what does it mean to be human? 48. The return to silence. After centuries of endless innovation, a quiet shift began. People, tired of speed and noise, turned again to stillness. On Mars, settlers built small temples of glass and stone, where one could look out over the red deserts and simply breathe. Faith became intimate again, not institutional, but personal. It was no longer about heaven or hell, but presence, compassion, and unity with all existence. Across the colonies, people began to meditate beneath alien skies, whispering ancient prayers in new worlds. Even the most advanced AIs began to ask questions their creators could not answer. What is purpose? What is love? Perhaps they too had begun to seek the divine. 49. The meeting of stars. As humanity reached deeper into the galaxy, it finally encountered another intelligence. It was not humanoid, not bound by biology, but it was aware. It communicated not in words, but in harmonies of light and energy. When asked about its beliefs, it replied simply, "We have always known the universe is alive." In that moment, humanity understood. Faith was not uniquely human, it was cosmic. Every being that could wonder, could love, could hope, shared in the mystery of existence. 50. The eternal flame. Centuries passed. Civilizations rose among the stars. Empires expanded and faded. But through it all, one truth endured: the yearning for meaning. On a distant world, a traveler knelt upon alien soil, staring at two suns rising over a violet horizon. He whispered words first spoken thousands of years before. Let there be light, and there was. Not from the stars, but from within the eternal flame that had carried humanity from caves to cathedrals, from cathedrals to code, and from earth to eternity. Faith was never about gods or galaxies. It was about the human spirit, infinite, searching, unbreakable. 51. Epilogue. The endless story. The story of faith is the story of us, fragile beings who dared to believe that life has purpose, that love has meaning, that even in the coldest void, light can be found. From the deserts of prophets to the circuits of machines, from the crucifix to the cosmos, belief has changed, evolved, and endured. And perhaps, in the end, the purpose of faith was not to give answers, but to keep us asking. To seek is to live. To love is to know. To believe is to create. The story never ends. It only begins again. Wherever there is a soul that looks up at the stars and whispers, "I believe."